on a beautiful Sunday morning. This is Media Monitor, the show that monitors and gives analysis of media coverage to some of the leading stories of the week. I am your host, Alicia Jaliwe, live right here on Channel 44. That's SABC News. A very good morning to you. In our lineup today, we start by discussing today's newspaper headlines, including the coverage of the worldwide spread of the deadly Ebola virus. Has the Oscar Pistorius trial opened doors for Jub and Themba Tshabalala? We scrutinize media interests on the Shrien Dewani murder case. We analyze the coverage of the group of people who have offered to pay back the money that was allegedly unduly spent to upgrade President Zuma's Nkandla home. And lastly, our analysts will unpack coverage of Uhuru Kenyatta's appearance at the International Criminal Court in The Hague. In other stories that dominated this week's headlines, of course, Pakistani child education activist Malala Yousafzai and Kailash Satyarthi, an Indian child rights campaigner, have jointly won the Nobel Peace Prize. And we congratulate, of course, Bafana Bafana for moving to the top of the African Nations Cup qualifying Group A after a 2-0 victory over Congo in Pointe-Noire yesterday. Now, to unpack media coverage today, we welcome Mr. Levi Doe. He's a lecturer at TUT, Mr. Siasanga Kyali, a lecturer at UNIS, and of course, Mr. Shoni Makari, a media analyst. And lastly on the line, we will be joined by Dr. Fru Benson, Chief Director of the Communicable Diseases Center. Now, to join the discussion and share your views, you can call us on +2711 714 6843, 714 6847, and 714 6857. You can also interact with us on Twitter at SA Media Monitor, and of course, like our Facebook page, Media Monitor. Very good morning to you. All right, now, before we get into discussion with stories that made headlines throughout the week, let's first take a look at today's newspaper headline panel. A very, very good morning to you, and thank you for joining us on Media Monitor. Let's start, of course, with City Press. The City Press headline says corruption is a Western thing. What are your views, Mr. Ndo?
Well, corruption cannot be Western or Eastern. Corruption is always a criminal activity, and it deals with ethical issues. And if there is any form of corruption in society, it's something that we need to ensure that we fight against at all costs, because it robs ordinary citizens of their own benefits, and it puts some people in some level of society where they don't deserve to be. Otherwise, if they did not work very hard. So corruption, whether it comes in different forms, it remains corruption, and something must be done in order to curb it.
But what do you think about that headline specifically, Siasanga? Corruption is a Western thing.
Well, it is very worrying that there is this line of thinking that we tend to put some things into Western perspective. But for me, I'm particularly interested in a headline that's tucked way inside the City Press, which deals with the closure of the school that's operating in Mpumalanga. And it was worrying to see the operation around that schools and to see the allegations that have been put forward of that school. So it was that I'm looking at now very interesting that the department has decided to close it down. Yeah.
Shoni, your views?
Well, for me, it's disappointing to see that line of thinking, as he said earlier, but also it discredits the president's argument, if that's what he said, in terms of dealing with the issue around the upgrades at his house, because suddenly, it actually takes the discussion to a much lower level, instead of actually focusing on if their line of thinking was that actually the president had nothing to do with it, and this is the people who were actually tasked with dealing with that those upgrades who actually overspent. That's a line we should stick with. If the issue about corruption being a Western thing is then thrown into the discussion, then it just cheapens the whole argument that he's trying to make.
Let's move on now to our next newspaper. Of course, that's the Sunday Times, and of course, SARS bugged Zuma. But let's talk about something else. It seems that lately Parliament seems to have its hands full dealing with the Nkandla issue. Has media probed into what's happening in terms of other legislatures? Shoni?
No, I think that's the unfortunate thing, because obviously, I think if you look at the history of Julius Malema, even when he was within the ANC and now, I mean, he's always been able to attract the attention of the media by pulling all sorts of stunts. And I think he's continuing along the same line, to the point where actually he's robbing his voters in terms of hearing what it is that the EFF stands for. They came into Parliament on the ticket of fighting for the poor. And the overalls were supposed to, put further weight into that argument. And now all we're seeing is just stunts. And I think that is very unfortunate.
Mr. Doe, what are your views about this story in particular?
Well, there are a lot of important issues that I think Parliament must be focusing on. If the EFF is worried about Nkandla, they have got all the reasons to do so. But at the same time, it is important for the EFF to push the mandate that they have in Parliament. Unfortunately, the focus now is on the activities of the EFF in Parliament rather than focusing on the core business of Parliament. I don't think the EFF is in Parliament only to focus on Nkandla, because if that is the case, they will easily lose focus in what brought them in Parliament. There are a lot of issues that Parliament has to focus on, and at the same time, the EFF must readjust themselves in order to address all the major challenges that society is actually facing today.
Siyasanga, what are your views about this group PMUT that has offered to pay for the president's expenditures?
Well, for me, I found it very interesting and very worrying at the same time, because the process of probing on what has happened, has not actually finished. And now to have people coming through and actually trying to divert the attention of what is actually happening in Parliament, that is very worrying. And I don't think that line of thinking and operation should actually be very acceptable in South Africa. It's something that we cannot tolerate, because there are processes to follow, and they have started. We have to wait for those processes to finish so that we can find out actually what has happened.
Let's move on to, of course, the Sunday Independent. Now, as I was driving on my way to work, I saw every poll had the world panics over Ebola. What are your views on this one, Siyasanga?
It is very interesting, but particularly I'm very interested on the coverage of Ebola by some of South African newspapers, because talking about health journalism and some of the panic that has arisen, in some cases that have been reported in South Africa, it's very worrying, because in one instance you saw the case of a man who had hemorrhagic fever in Potchefstroom, and now the headlines were that this guy had Ebola. And coming from a health journalism perspective, we need our journalists to actually probe and find out what is actually happening, because not every case of hemorrhagic fever is actually Ebola. And by reporting that line, it means that we are causing unnecessary panic. So it is very worrying on that perspective.
All right, let's move on now. The report, funny enough, shares the same headline, of course, as the City Press, and they're also talking about corruption being a Western thing. Somebody put a point through last week, one of our callers, saying that we tend to look at what the media has reported in terms of print. Let's now compare these headlines that we've gone through, panel. Did they make such a profound noise in terms of radio and television? Let's start with you, Mr. Ndo.
Well, it actually depends, but currently most of the newspaper headlines are not new. I was thinking about it whilst coming over to the studio to say that every day we're talking about Nkandla, every day we're talking about disruptions in Parliament. There is nothing new that is happening, and it's making the reading of papers a bit boring these days, because there's no new information that is actually coming. Maybe some people that have got sufficient information to submit, especially with corruption activities, with arms deals, should actually go to the commission. But the impact that the newspaper headlines are actually making now is quite minimal. But with Ebola, I think a lot is supposed to be written about, especially when it comes to awareness, that we very much panicking that at any time I can be contracted with Ebola virus. So I think information is quite very much necessary, even though there are a lot of steps that government is actually trying to come up with. But a lot of awareness is actually needed.
Very valid points there, Mr. Do. Well, we're going to take a very quick ad break, and when we return, we're going to discuss the coverage of the Ebola virus. You can still share your views and comments on Twitter at SA Media Monitor, and of course, like our Facebook page, Media Monitor. Don't go anywhere. We'll return shortly after this.
Zoom into Africa. This is Ghana. The president is Mr. John Dramani Mahama. Ghana got independent from the United Kingdom on 6 March in 1957. The population is more than 25 million people. One of Ghana's major languages spoken is English. Monetary unit is cedi.
Welcome back to Media Monitor. You can also be part of the Ebola virus discussion by calling us on +2711 714 6843, 714 6847 and 714 6857. And let us know which stories, other stories you feel were not adequately covered by the media, or those stories that were very, very well covered. Come on, let's give credit where it's due. Now, let's take a look at our next story. The Ebola outbreak took center stage at the annual meetings of the World Bank and International Monetary Fund in Washington, where a high-level gathering was convened to discuss the crisis. Let's take a look at this insert.
World leaders have described the virus as an international threat that requires fast international response.
We have to have 20-fold, 20 times more resources and speed to cut this curve of spread of Ebola virus.
West African countries battling with Ebola say the deadly virus is outpacing the world response. They are appealing for more assistance. Meanwhile, other African countries such as South Africa are strengthening their measures to fight the outbreak.
We also strengthened port health, the ports of entry, especially OR Tambo International Airport and Lanseria, because we expect that if there's going to be entry in South Africa, the likelihood is that it will be through the two airports.
Minister Motsoaledi has described the current outbreak as public health emergency.
Panel, I just want us to quickly discuss the coverage of the seemingly slow reaction by the global media. Let's start with you, Shani.
Well, if you'll indulge me, Elisha, there's another more pressing issue that I'd like to touch on. I think what is the coverage also reflects on some of the things that are happening in our newsrooms, particularly in South Africa. We are entering a phase when we're now losing sector specialists. We're not getting this kind of analysis that we used to get in the past. For instance, the story that I've been waiting to see is if the global economy is facing a challenge, the IMF has a response plan in place. We have nothing of the sort around health issues. We don't know how. You know, one of the IMF chiefs was actually admitted as such last night on international media to say that, you know what, when we have a global economic crisis, we know exactly how to respond. But when we have a global health crisis, you know, we basically fumble along until, you know, some type of plan is put together. And to me, that is worrying. But the also worrying thing is, where are the sector specialists who can actually cover stories like those? Moreover, for instance, the Observer in the UK this morning was leading on the story in terms of saying that it's telling the story from the perspective of the children who are being affected, because a lot of children are actually being left orphaned and ostracized. We're not seeing any of that in our local media. Again, maybe because we're doing briefcase journalism. We don't have people who are actually going to the regions or close by even to try and find out and give us a more in-depth analysis.
Trend. That's a very worrying trend there, Shani. But let's take on the line. Let's welcome Dr. Fru Gerald Benson, the National Chief Director of the Communicable Diseases Center from the Department of Health. Doctor, a very good morning to you, and thank you so much for joining us on Media Monitor.
Good morning, Alicia.
All right,
good
now,
morning
Doctor,
to the panel members.
Now, Doctor, you've heard what our panelists are saying in studio, but there seems to be little knowledge of this disease. Briefly explain it to us.
Well, you've got a disease, a hemorrhagic state that's caused primarily by a virus. Now, you have 3 types of viruses that can cause viral hemorrhagic fever. You have one that in this particular case, Ebola and Marburg virus, that's bat associated and bat-borne. Then you've got viruses that is arthropod-borne, and those examples are yellow fever and Rift Valley fever. Rift Valley fever is endemic in South Africa that you can get. But the other common one is Congo fever that you can get. And then you have rodent-associated viruses, and those examples are Lassa fever, and one type of arenavirus that occurred in South Africa, which is called Lujo virus. It came from Lusaka to South Africa, so therefore Lusaka and Johannesburg, Lujo virus.
Thank you so much, Doctor. Please stay on the line. We're going to take some questions for you very quickly. Now, let's just discuss this panel. The local media, have we seen increased awareness on really what the basics of what Ebola really is? Siyasanga, what do you think?
Well, for me, what I've observed is that in terms of coverage of the general issues around Ebola, we have seen those, especially on television. But more, what we have not seen is actually awareness around the Ebola itself. You know, what is it? You know, what to look for, and all those things. So I found that particular very interesting because one asks themselves, if you know a person displays these symptoms and no one really knows what is happening, are we going to take this as an Ebola case or not? And so that line of awareness has been really lacking in our mainstream media. I've observed only particular one television channel which has shown that, but I've seen that there's a particular lack of awareness around the disease itself.
Let's hear from the doctor now. Doctor, at this stage we still don't have a confirmed Ebola case in South Africa, but just humor us, how ready is South Africa to fight this virus? What measures have been put in place to fight back at the outbreak?
Okay, now in terms of the measures that one can put in place, in Ebola there's no specific treatment for. So what the most effective measure that you've got is to identify the disease early and then therefore break the chain of transmission, to isolate the case early and break the chain of transmission. Now, related to this, what protects us, the measures that's been introduced, is first of all, from the countries where people are coming from. We remember at the moment the outbreak is only in West Africa. Now, in those countries, when people travel, they are screened at the airports. When any person have the disease or have been in contact with a person with the disease, that person is not allowed to travel from that particular country. So that's a preventative measure. Now, at our ports of entry, now the most likely ports that a person would come will be our airports. The main airports are OR Tambo and Lanseria Airport. Lanseria Airport is it's a place through which sick individuals are transferred into the country. At these airports, we've got thermal screening in order to pick up any person with symptoms, and the most common symptoms is raised temperature. So that's why we're screening for temperature. But we also have questionnaires, health questionnaires, specifically for people coming from West Africa, that they need to indicate to us the symptoms that they may be suffering from. So that measure we've got. In addition to that, we've got a National Health Operations Center that's active. What people that come to us from West Africa need to inform us, and they need to get permission from us to come to West Africa. But the reason for this permission is so that we know who's coming in. We then follow them up for 21 days to find out when they develop symptoms, because that is the measures that we've got against Ebola, to identify it early, to trace all the contacts, to keep the cases in isolation, and to keep the patients that may have been in contact in quarantine.
And of course, Doctor, so far you'd say these measures have been quite effective since we haven't had a reported case in the country yet.
That's correct. But we earlier had one of the panelists saying about the symptoms, that it's there's no wide announcement of the symptoms. The symptoms are very non-specific. For instance, the person in Potchefstroom that you earlier spoke about, this person had symptoms of bleeding and fever, which is very common, but he hasn't been in contact with a person with Ebola. He hasn't traveled to West Africa. Therefore, he does not meet the case definition. And in that particular case, you wouldn't even test such a person for Ebola.
All right. All right. Thank you, Doctor. Thank you so much for your time and your knowledge here on the show this morning. All right, that was Dr. Gerald Benson, the National Chief Director of the Center for Communicable Diseases from the Department of Health. Now, panel, just the stats that came out this morning from the World Health Organization, 4,033 are dead from Ebola, and of course, 8,999 new cases as of this morning. Now, the newspaper reports that it would just take one carrier to change the situation in South Africa, particularly in a community that is largely housed in a densely populated city center of Johannesburg, an ideal breeding ground for a communicable virus such as Ebola. Have we seen more awareness increased on that, Shoni?
Well, I think to start off, I would like to just comment on something that the media is doing well, which is and that is they're covering widely the fact that we need to isolate Ebola, not isolate countries where Ebola it comes from. And this has been covered widely from international as well as local media. Because I read a report not so long ago where Mauritius apparently had stopped flights from countries with Ebola, and that's not a very constructive move. So certainly there's more and more awareness, certainly not about what it's about, but certainly that it is a deadly disease, and we need to be careful.
All right, Shoni. All right, we're going to have to leave it there, Shoni, and take a break. But when we return,
the 4 convictions of murder are set aside and replaced with 4 convictions of culpable homicide. The 2 convictions of attempted murder are set aside.
A huge part of this African growth is technological innovation.
Governments here are working hard to ensure that the continent's technology matches that of more advanced countries.
High-speed internet connectivity is regarded as a utility.
As the continent battles diseases like Ebola, social media becomes the preferred method to share information.
The people on social media are some of the society's most influential.
To find out more, join me, Phumelele Zondi, on Network every Sunday at 7:30 p.m. only on SABC News.
Welcome back. This is Media Monitor, and you can also be part of the Themba, Tshabalala and Dewani murder trial discussions by calling us on +2 711 714 6843, 714 6847 and 714 6857. In our next story, very few South Africans had ever heard of dolus eventualis, the same legal term that helped Paralympian Oscar Pistorius dodge a murder conviction, slashed the jail sentences of disgraced hip-hop star Molemo Jub Marohanye and fellow killer driver Themba Tshabalala. Let's take a look at this insert. All right, panel, let's go on. We don't seem to have the insert there, but the term dolus eventualis, the legal definition says awareness of the likely outcome of an action. Now, Oscar's trial shone a very big spotlight on this. Let's talk about this, panel. How has it changed the face of legal terms in South Africa for you, Mr. Ndo?
Well, it's something quite difficult to understand, but obviously to need people with legal brains. But I think one biggest question that we need to ask ourselves, and which the society is busy asking, is as to whether the judges can come forward and say openly that at times we're being influenced in taking decision based on what the view of the public is actually saying. Because in my humble view, that is what I observed with the trial case. One would say that in a way, maybe the judges of the prosecution was influenced by pressure from society. And at the same time, when you look at the Oscar Pistorius case, something of the similar nature happened, wherein there was a lot of pressure and expectations on the part of the society. But unfortunately, the outcome of the Pistorius case was totally different to that of Jub Jub. And that is why now, with the appeal, there is a different view that is being brought by the appeal case. And I don't know if the NPA will still appeal the Pistorius case and still get a different outcome.
I want to hear your views, Sean.
Again, my theme for the morning, disappearance of sector specialists. What is missing here? I wouldn't necessarily blame the judge for interpreting the law the way they have, because a lot of the other legal experts have said, actually, that is what our law says. So our journalists should be saying, clearly we have a gap. If people are unhappy with the kind of sentences that are being meted out to crimes of this nature, then we clearly have a gap, and that's what we need to address. And by lobbying Parliament to come make sure that those kind of sentences are a little harsher, and then we'll cover the gap and deal with dollars eventualis and whatnot.
Siyasanga, the South African justice system received a fair amount of criticism over the resentencing on this case. Has the media done enough to educate rank and file on how our justice system works? And I know Mr. Ndo said that it will take a legal mind, but media is there, it's their responsibility to explain it in layman's terms.
Yeah, I think that it has. For the last few months, we've seen high-profile cases, and there has been a whole lot of reporting around these cases. And what this has done is that it has allowed us to be familiar with the processes, that goes into our justice system. It has allowed us to be familiar with some of the terminology that that are used. You mentioned dollars, some Latin term, and I don't think without these cases, we would have had privy to how these things works, and so I think our South African media has done quite a lot, to actually allow us to understand how these processes work.
Look, panel, I understand that the Jub Jub trial was not broadcast on television, but let's be honest here. Did media ever interrogate these two possible sentences or terms in terms of dollars eventualis and not at that time of sentencing, Mr. Ndo? Why are we questioning it now?
No, well, the media did not do that. But when you look at the coverage of the Jub Jub trial, you would always see people that were singing outside the court, school children, who were putting some sort of pressure to the justice system. But I think as well, we need to go back to our education system as well. We always say that law is only being taught to school children, and we only get people only study law at universities. I think that's another special area that the Department of Education has to focus on. Because if you never studied law at the university, it becomes extremely difficult for one to be able to grapple with all the legal issues and processes, which becomes a problem. That is why in society today, you have got a lot of people who are committing criminal activities, and when they appear in court, they will say, I didn't know that what I was doing was wrong. Hence, we're getting concepts like corruption is a Western thing. This is because of the poor knowledge of the legal processes that we have in society. And I think the education department must do something about this crisis.
What are you going to do about it, Siyasanga? Very quickly.
What am I going to be doing?
In terms of education, are you going to push forward that, legal matters be a free subject maybe to all students in high school or even university level?
Yeah, I think that what we can do, coming from higher education, we can at least allow, students to, for instance, explain, this case, whether they appear in the media, and try to interpret those. For instance, if ever you are putting down an assignment or whatever for a student, put it down so that at least you can judge, whether the educational aspect of the media has been fulfilled, by allowing students to take these cases, and interpret them. So I think that is how I can do my role.
All right. Well, hopefully you're going to be seeing some of that at UNISA. Well, let's move on to our next story now. The first week of the much-awaited trial of honeymoon murderer suspect Shrien Dewani has concluded and has been adjourned in the Western Cape High Court for tomorrow. Panel, Another gruesome trial, shocking details emerging daily. British media reporting that they actually never thought that Shrien Dewani would ever get his day in trial in South Africa. Mr. Nto, what do you feel about that?
Well, maybe it's time that we appreciate what the South African government has done in order to ensure that he comes back to South Africa and have his day in court. I got a message yesterday, a quite interesting message as well. This is a high-profile case, and somebody said it's like it's the word of Dewani himself saying that in this case I need Judge Masipa to come and preside over this case. And you see now, it means that the perceptions have grown in society that Judge A is lenient, Judge B is very harsh. And I think now people are able to say that there seem to be inconsistencies in terms of decision-making by judges, and which creates a very, very big problem to our own society.
Shani.
Well, I think another thing that the media is not highlighting enough is the fact that there seems to be a positive correlation between the size of your wallet and the type of justice you're going to get. As you can see, the name O.J. Simpson comes to mind, among with, obviously some of our own local cases. You go to some of our, prisons, or, the jails rather, you'll find a lot of, prisoners awaiting trial because they don't even have the money to post bail, among other things. So it's that type of problem that obviously I would like to see the media say more about it.
Panel, you know what worries me? This is a huge case involving foreign nationals, locals, extradition, mental observations. Is the media still focusing on the real issue at hand, the fact that somebody lost her life here?
I think that to a certain extent we might be losing focus, looking at some of the coverage of last week where we've seen some of, of our media houses sensationalizing some of the issues around the case itself. For instance, we've seen some newspapers highlighting the fact that this guy was watching homosexual pornography. And you ask yourself, in a progressive, society that is supposed to be our own, would it be important to highlight, the issue of the sexuality within the pornography? So I think that there is an element of sensationalizing issues, and running with issues that we think our headlines will actually make money for us. And that is actually very concerning. So that is my view around some of the reporting that we have seen around this case.
And just to substantiate your point there, Siyasanga, this is News 24 this morning. In news media, Kwabe's testimony takes the forefront, but in social media, Dewani's sexuality is the focus. And then he said that in South African media, nearly 1/3 of all items were about the honeymoon murder trial, which began on Monday. This coverage, now this is shocking, was second only to news about President Jacob Zuma, which made up just over 40% of all national media reports. Isn't that worrying?
It's quite worrying. I think as well there is a view out there that says that if you have got a criminal case against you, the focus is not only on the actual case, it's on other issues closer to the case. Because I don't think the Dewani case is about his sexuality. It's about somebody who has been murdered. And that is how the court has to focus on. The other issues to me are quite minimal. And at the same time, I think this case is coming at the right time when the emotions are low. I don't think there is anger anymore. And everybody who is involved must be afforded sufficient time to look at all the facts and then come to a reasonable decision in terms of the prosecution.
Shani.
But also it kind of tells us what's going on in our, especially with our printed media. We're becoming more and more tabloid. When a newspaper like The Independent leads with Dewani's 15,000 rand tip, you kind of get the picture of where we're going. I mean, this is supposed to be the paper that targets the intellectuals and so on, and yet they're leading with a tip of 15,000. And to me, I'm seeing that almost across the board, that this is where our newspapers are going. Sensationalism, and whatever has the biggest screaming headline will sell more papers, and apparently people still have to pay their bills. So
And somebody said, well, there's nothing that, is reassuring them to pick up a newspaper and read anymore. Well, we're going to take a very quick ad break, and when we return, we're going to discuss the latest on Uhuru Kenyatta's ICC appearance and wrap up, of course, with your tweets, and also discuss what the panel thinks will be making news headlines this week. You can still call us on +2 711 714 6847, 714 6843, 714 6857. Share views and comments on Twitter at SA Media Monitor, and of course, like our Facebook page. We'll be back shortly after the stay with us.
Since its inception, the city of Durban has sent a group of designers on an internship program in Milan, the fashion capital of the world. The origins of belly dancing are unclear, but its history in Egypt goes back to the 18th and 19th centuries, where dancers were known as wawazi. Inala's original music is composed and performed by Ladysmith Black Mambazo, the multiple Grammy Award-winning South African isicathamiya group led by Joseph Tshabalala and Ella Spira. Inala blends the rhythms and harmonies of native musical roots with live percussion, piano and strings.
Join Musam Khalipi on Afro Showbiz every Saturday at 19:30 CAT.
Welcome back to Media Monitor. You can still be part of our Uhuru Kenyatta discussion by calling us on +2 711 714 6843, 714 6847, 714 6857. Our next story, Kenyan head of state Uhuru Kenyatta has received a protagonist welcome upon his arrival at his home country after he appeared before the International Criminal Court in The Hague. SABC East Africa correspondent Sarah Kimani compiled this report for us.
It is a story that inevitably dominated the headlines in Kenya and considerable coverage in the international media. Various media houses had journalists at The Hague, where television reporters gave hourly updates on the status conference and Kenyatta's arrival and departure from the International Criminal Court. We asked Kenyans what they thought of the coverage.
The media has been very objective. Kenyans, I think they are seeing exactly what is happening, and they are able to make decisions, especially on the media. But I think the problem is not really the local media, it's the international media that is portraying a very negative picture on Kenya.
I will actually rate it in 80 to 20%. 80% to the suspects who talk of Uhuru Kenyatta and William Ruto. They've been given so much emphasis by the local media, but little has been said about the victims of the post-election violence.
Media expert Faith Colley, however, feels the media erred by focusing on the personality that is President Kenyatta and leaving out the issues around the case.
I feel that there's a sense of the story is now in a way politicized, and even in a way has given him mileage, and he's been able to garner a lot of support from Kenyans.
Research has shown that media in Kenya is the most trusted source of information among Kenyans. Colley feels advertising revenue sometimes drives the media agenda. The ICC story is no different, she adds.
In as much as revenue is generated from the private sector, a lot of it is also generated from government advertising and whichever way. So I would think there are two competing agendas, and the piper calls the tune.
Very interesting indeed. Now, panel, Kenyatta is the first ever sitting head of state to be charged at the criminal court. Now, he's charged with crimes against humanity. Has the media looked more into that instead of how he was welcomed when he came back from the ICC?
I don't think they did. And in fact, he actually said something which is interesting, and I would like to see the media probe that deeper. He wasn't the first to say so. He accused the ICC of only targeting African leaders. Now, I suppose he was alluding to the fact that George Bush and Blair went to Iraq on the pretense of weapons of mass destruction, which were never there. And, you know, it would have been nice to see the media actually say, well, does he have a point? Let's look at the history of indictments and all the other people who have been held before the court. You know, where did they come from? were the charges substantive and all those issues.
Thank you very much, Shawnee. Let's take Zig from Randburg. Zig, a very good morning to you. Thank you for joining us. Your comment, please, sir.
Good morning. Thank you very much, Alicia. Even in the aftermath, even after the miscarriage was fully exposed, even afterwards, we still don't know why this happened, and why nobody knew that it was totally wrong to convict people for murder when they did not have the intention. They weren't suicide bombers in these racing cars of theirs in Soweto. They weren't committing suicide, which is the alternative to what they were charged with, and this was nonsense. It is a seriously bad national prosecuting authority that was trying these people by public opinion. This was a kangaroo trial, and the whole nation let it happen. This was a shocking disgrace to our judiciary, and nobody said it. And yes, the press can't solve all these problems. But by golly, there was nobody else in this country who protested, to my knowledge, at all. What happened to Professor Pierre de Vos? People
all right,
like
thank
that.
you, Zig.
And yes, there is a danger of more of this happening.
All right.
Popular opinion.
All right, thank you so much. That's Zig out in Randburg. I think we're going to see more of the mixed reactions, of course, in pertaining to the Jub case, and I think we might see a lot of that pick up this week. What do you think? Very quickly. Mr.
Well, I think we're going to have a lot of pickup and a lot of reactions. And I think it's time now that we get legal experts as well to come forward in order to explain these processes to the entire nation. We have seen a lot of people angry. Yeah, we have seen a lot of people angry. The reactions of the children, of the parents of the children who died, and from ordinary citizens as well. There has been a lot of reactions. But at the same time, I go back to my own view that says that we need to understand the legal processes in society. One can be charged, one can still appeal and follow all the course of the law. I think that is what we're going to see picking up in the course of the week.
Very interesting. All right, let's return now to our ICC, of course. Yesanga, I want to hear your views about the sitting president and how much of his actual charges were covered by the media.
Well, first of all, I think that it's very admirable of what Uhuru Kenyatta did to actually take time off from his presidency and actually attend, the ICC hearing, because for a while we heard that, this guy is going to try to dodge, the hearing because he's going to use his presidency to try and dodge the hearing. But equally, I think that what he did is to actually, allow us to see what the ICC is all about, because as he said that, for quite a number of time, there has been an argument that, the ICC is unfairly targeting, African leaders, And so it's important that, he's be supported in what he's trying to do, because he's saying that, okay, trial me and then allow me to defend myself. And, if our media can, show us what is happening around that case, it would be, very admirable.
Levi?
Yeah, well, I think we can also take it further by saying that he is acting as an exemplary leader by going to appear before the International Criminal Court to prove to everybody that all of us are equal before the law. But one most important aspect of his appearance is that when he appears, he appears having taken over, having relinquished all his executive powers. And there has been a view that says that the government of Kenya has not been cooperating with the ICC.
Yes.
And key witnesses are also not cooperating. Then it means that there is a possibility of the ICC not having a case against him because important and sufficient information is not available, and the government is not cooperating. And he goes there having relinquished his executive powers. So they cannot force him to ensure or to force the government to cooperate. That is another technicality that he's actually bringing. If they continue with the case without sufficient information, the government not cooperating, the possibilities they might not be having a case against him.
That's very true, Mr. Ndoro. The prosecution did actually say that they might not have sufficient evidence to substantiate this charge. So we're really going to see what's going to happen in terms of that. Panel, Let's now see what you think will be making news headlines next week before I read the tweets. Shani, let's start with you.
Well, I think Ebola will continue to dominate our lives. I would like to see more emphasis on the song that people have started, singing right now, which is "Let's isolate the disease, not the countries affected by it," because somebody did a rough measure saying about $32 billion could be lost if we were to isolate those three countries out of the global economy. So I would like to see that kind of reporting continue, but I do believe that Ebola will be certainly internationally and domestically, but obviously Dewani will also dominate our space.
Gruesome details coming out of that trial. Siyasanga, what will be making news headlines for you this week?
I think that the Dewani case will be very important, for our media space. I would like the media I would like to see less sensational stories around the case, and see more informed opinion, informed knowledge on what is happening around the case itself, to explain some of the pertinent issues.
So that we don't get a jub story at the end of the trial once again.
Exactly. I think that Ebola as well will be coverage substantial by our media, partly because I think that, the United States and other countries are actually starting to realize that, the Ebola will come to us, if we don't do anything about it. And we've seen that, what happened with the guy who died in the States. So I think that they will, take notice of what is happening. And
because now it has reached the US.
Exactly.
That's very scary though. Jeez. Mr. No, what do you anticipate will be making news headlines this week?
Well, those are I would love
ones.
to add on what the colleagues are saying, but I will expect the media to go back to Pretoria for the Pistorius final case. And I think that one is not only going to be a national one, it's going to be international, and then get a lot of responses from the people. So next week, it's just a legal week.
Wow,
for
it's
South
a legal
Africa.
week all through. All right, let's take some of the tweets that some of our loyal viewers have, of course, sent to us on some of the topics that we're discussing today. Let's take Singedile. Singedile, yes, says strict border control measures should be imposed. We can't afford to suffer from Ebola. Singedile, thank you so much for your comment there. Geraldine Buerta says West Africans now being allowed entry to South Africa. Crazy. Thank you so much. That's Geraldine Botha. And of course, Malibongwe Manyonya says, I don't know where is our justice going to. This shows how weak it is. What about the victims? And of course, that's in relation to the Jub Jub story. Libu Malaudze says it doesn't make any sense. South African justice is unfair. And of course, Andrew Paho says, my views, out of all countries, someone chooses a plot to kill his partner in South Africa using our people. Isn't that degrading? And last but not least, is Pio says, no, they've not investigated anything. Instead, a lawless autocrat, Kenyatta, is being portrayed as a martyr. Well, that's our viewers' contributions there on Twitter, telling us what they think about some of the topics that we've covered today. Thank you so much, panel, for joining me today. And of course, our viewers' contributions and suggestions is highly valued. You can follow us on Twitter at SA Media Monitor and share your views and comments on Facebook. Go to www.facebook.com/Media Monitor and of course, like our page. You can also email us your views about the show to mediamonitor@sabc.co.za. Thank you so much for watching Media Monitor. Do join us again next week right here on the SABC News channel. Just in case you missed our live show, remember you can still catch the repeat show tomorrow morning at 2 a.m. or go to our SABC YouTube link on www.youtube.com/SABC News. For myself, Alisha Jali, and the rest of the Q-Tip team, have yourself a blessed Sunday.